All right. Allow me to introduce Vincent McCoy. So far we... Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah, go ahead.
So far we've heard exclusively from graduate students from the Religious Studies Department. Vincent McCoy is actually a graduate student from the Philosophy Department.
Nice. I have to change the technology about a little bit. I've got my own thing. Don't let this fool you into thinking I'm better with technology. I'm showing a YouTube video halfway through, and it's in 2 parts because that's apparently how YouTube works. Also, a little commentary on a previous presenter's presentation. Anyway, I'll come back to my actual presentation. Now, sorry. Today I'm talking about the echoes of Christianity and Christian culture in modern popular culture. That we live in an age and a culture today where the echoes and the themes of Christianity, the Christian myth, are so pervasive that we don't notice them. So I'm going to start off telling a story. So listen here and see if you recognize what I'm talking about here. So the hero and his friends are facing defeat from the villain. This is at the climax of the story, just before it ends. The hero, instead of overcoming the villain by some feat of power, allows himself to be defeated in order to save those he loves. In the end, this defeat at the hands of the villain winds up being the villain's undoing, and the hero is ultimately victorious. Harry Potter! Okay, right? Harry confronts Voldemort. He allows Voldemort to kill him, and that ultimately leads to Voldemort's destruction. Now, that's perfectly true. Or, on the other hand, am I retelling the story of Luke Skywalker, who at the end of Return of the Jedi surrenders to the Emperor, throws away his lightsaber, and refuses to kill his father, and in the throes of defeat, winds up being victorious. Or, maybe, I'm talking about Jesus. Jesus, God became man, who decides to allow himself to be killed, to enter into death itself, to save those he loves, the human race. So, I want to show one particular example from a perhaps unexpected place, somewhere we wouldn't necessarily expect to find such a bit of Christian mythology or Christian symbolism. And that is from, in this case, from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, of all things, Thor. So this is the part where there's 2 pieces because something to do with copyright, I'm guessing. So I apologize, and I also apologize for the camera. This is probably going to get demonetized.
What's he doing?
Brother, whatever I have done to wrong you, whatever I have done to lead you to do this, I am truly sorry. But these people are innocent. Taking their lives will gain you nothing. So take mine and end this.
How do you think this is going to end? Well, here's the next part. Conveniently, the clip ends, so let's go.
It's over.
No, it's not over.
You're safe.
You're safe.
It's over.
Whosoever holds this hammer, if it be worthy, shall possess the power of Thor.
All right, we're gonna. I know. I don't want to move this up. All right, so the point, showing all this, was to point out the striking and perhaps surprising similarity between. Thanks. Between this book from a movie, which is supposed to portray a comic book superhero as a figure from Norse mythology, the Norse god of thunder, but in at least a couple of cases, he is one minor mistranslation away from quoting the gospel. Right? It's over. It's finished. Right? Same thing. Right there, throughout this entire scene, we see essentially a depiction of the story of Christ. In fact, this story would be incredibly alien to the Thor that we see in the Eddas, the traditional mythological Norse god of thunder. A god who comes to Earth, is stripped of his power, who willingly sacrifices himself, making himself weak in this way in order to save those he loves. Now, yes, traditionally in mythology, Thor does die to save people, but he dies in battle. It is a stark difference. And this image of Thor we have, yes, it strikes us as a typical story of a typical hero. But it would strike someone familiar with Thor, the god, as bizarre, perhaps unrecognizable. And Thor isn't the only example of this even in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. We also have, for example, that's the only clip I'm going to show, sorry. We have Iron Man in the Avengers, where he rides a nuclear weapon into what is basically hell itself through this wormhole, defeating the enemies that are threatening the people he loves, threatening Manhattan, almost dying in the process, and he comes back all the stronger. We have Captain America, Steve Rogers, where his go-to technique for fighting people stronger than him is to get punched until the person who's punching him can't do it anymore. I can do this all day. And maybe the most prototypically, we've got Doctor Strange, whose method of victory is to go into the domain of what is effectively Satan and be defeated over and over and over again for all eternity so that eventually he comes away victorious. Dormammu becomes a bargain. All of these examples are, I hesitate to say unintentional, but certainly not intended to be Christ figures. Even if they are, they're very strongly types of Christ figure. Now, this one in particular, the case of Thor. This is as far as you can probably get from somebody trying to put some hero to look like Christ into a comic book movie. right? But it's so deeply embedded in our own culture that we recognize it as the hero, but we don't recognize it as Christ, this prototypical example of the hero that's fundamental and foundational to our culture. What we do recognize we recognize it as a hero. Now, what may be even more fascinating is we may not even recognize this type, this Christ figure, if we're writing it, especially people in a modern secularized West. So what can we take away from this? Well, the chief implication, I think, is that we, as a culture, are not any longer consciously Christian. We don't write Christ figures, and when we do, they don't turn out quite right. So if you look at Man of Steel, with the almost constant use of Christian imagery of Superman floating away from the ship cruciform and such, right? The imagery is there, but the substance is missing. Whereas where it's unintentional, where we only seek to portray the hero as heroic, we wound up making Christ figures, where one was never intended in the first place. So I think what we can see here is that what remains of Christianity in our culture is still incredibly fundamental in our cultural milieu, but it's no longer conscious. We only see it through the lens of the everyday. So I hadn't planned on connecting this to our discussion of indigenous religion or our discussion of memes or any of the other discussions, but it becomes a sort of us. This seems so familiar just because it is familiar. It doesn't seem odd or different. And when we try and look at it from the outside, then it looks strange. So that wasn't the ending I was planning on. But I think it's a good point to wrap on. So that's all I've got. And I think that this